In times of solidarity, in times of crisis, we need solidarity among neighbors, among citizens, and also among EU states. And it has taken long before solidarity started to appear.
Before we start, I would like you to listen to an act from an 1869 opera, Les Brigands, or The Bandits, by the Alsace composer Jacques Offenbach. And in this particular act, we're listening to a group of bandits dressed up as beggars who are about to rob the rich.
And what is happening in the scene? There is a cook.
So what you can see in the opera act is that the beggars are begging the rich and first and foremost the chefs of the rich to give money and let them enter the court. And then when they enter the court, they turn out to be bandits, and actually kind of Robin Hood-like bandits who are stealing from the rich and giving it back to the poor.
We could say the cook is Netherlands and the beggars are the southern European countries, no?
That was kind of my question. I think the opera resembles somehow the current real-life opera in European politics. The southern European economies are on the edge of economic collapse because of the coronavirus crisis and are begging in Brussels for European financial aid. However, the Netherlands and Germany seem very stubborn in the crisis. They believe that the southern countries have been irresponsible for years, and so they do not want to allow Italy, Spain, and Portugal to increase their debt. I am today with Madrid-based political scientist Martín Rodríguez Alberdi. Martin, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Martin, don't you agree that some Dutch and German politicians perceive the southern governments as bandits rather than beggars?
Well, that's something, that's the perception, let's say, of the public sphere in Spain, that at least in Netherlands at the moment, there is a consensus that, let's say, Spain should have done their homework in terms of debt reduction in the last 10 years, and therefore are not entitled to issuing common debt or having common fiscal response at the European level. But again, this is the Spanish perception of the Dutch public sphere. So I guess the discussion is more nuanced in the Netherlands, right?
I don't think it is. I think that's a very good perception of the Spanish people in the Dutch public sphere. Well, okay, of course we can talk in nuances, but the kind of opinions that I'm hearing around me in the Netherlands are a bit split, let's put it like that. I think a part of the Dutch feel a lot of sympathy for the South and believe that this would be the moment that the European Union acts in a way that the North will unquestionably support the South. But there are also a lot of Dutch people who indeed do perceive the Southerners, maybe not as bandits, but at least as very irresponsible economic players whom shouldn't right now receive money that the North probably needs in the long term too.
I was reading a news this morning and it was saying that basically the whole, let's say, stance in the European Council, Dutch stance in the European Council was a PR stand, in the sense that there are elections next year in Netherlands, and both the finance minister and Rutte, I don't remember the name of the finance minister, Honstra or something like that.
Wopke Hoekstra.
Impossible. And so this article was saying that because the Dutch public opinion is so, let's say, the consensus is against the issuing of euro bonds or corona bonds or reconstruction bonds, they are basically trying to portray themselves domestically as having the hardest position towards the Southern European countries. I don't know if you agree with this view.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. And I think whether you are in favor of the stance of the Dutch government or not, I do think that we should all realize that the strategy behind it is not a very realistic one. Because in the end, they are very afraid that the Eurosceptic right-wing populist parties, who right now altogether form the biggest opposition threat, will not gain in popularity no matter what the decision is going to be from the governmental point of view. Or let's put it like this, they're not going to be less or more popular, whatever the Dutch government is deciding right now in the European Union. If they're going to have a tough stance towards the South, the populists will still say, well, the real problem is that we're still part of the European Union, and this only proves that the European Union is useless, right? So either way, I think they're trying to like flirt with the populist right, and I don't think it will succeed in taking this tough stance. So if taking this stance, it should be for different reasons than political PR. Martin, the reason why I thought we should have an episode on the Spanish crisis in the corona situation is that there are many indications that the Spanish situation is perhaps the most problematic one in the European Union. And I'm basing this mostly on my observation that in the European polls, most governments right now are increasing in popularity, no matter really what their policies are in the coronavirus crisis. But the Spanish government is not. The Spanish government is right now actually losing a lot of popularity. So my question to you would be, what went wrong in Spain?
Well, I cannot talk in cross-country perspective because I do not know the details of the other countries, just broadly. But let's say I'm going to go through this, the timing of the quarantine, and maybe this can clarify a little bit what might have gone wrong. So basically, on the 9th of February, there was the first case in Spain, and the minister responsible, or the ministry responsible of handling the corona crisis, said that in Spain there were going to be only a handful of cases on the 9th of February.
9th of February, give me a bit of a context. What was happening in Italy on the 9th of February? Was there already a lockdown there?
No, there was no lockdown in Italy, no. But the situation was more advanced in Italy, obviously. But there was no lockdown in Italy. On the 19th of February, there is a football match between Atlanta and Valencia in Bergamo, which is one of the most infected cities in Italy. And basically, a lot of people mobilized to go to see the match in Bergamo, and they came back to Valencia, where the first big outbreak happened in Spain. Again, this was before, let's say, the situation had escalated in Italy. But it can give you like a timeline of the things that have gone especially wrong in Spain. And then on the 8th of March, there was a massive demonstration for the International Women's Day in Madrid and in other Spanish cities. And basically, the opposition says, or the media says in general, that this was the biggest mistake, because the next day was the state of alarm was declared, and one day before there were massive demonstrations on the street. So there is a mismatch here between the actual health risk that was happening and the political credit that the government wanted to take out from the demonstration, from the Women's Day demonstration, because it gives them political leverage, let's say.
Right, because I mean, this is maybe good to mention here that the current government in Spain is a social democrat and left-wing government. So their policies and their ideology very much fits in line with such demonstrations as the Women's March.
Exactly. And now what we don't know yet is whether the health authorities had, let's say, given their consent to the organization of the International Women's Day demonstrations. So this is still unclear, because this would explain a lot the failure of the Spanish state. If they get a policy recommendation from the health authority saying you have to shut down all demonstrations, and they despite the recommendation, they organize it, this would be a massive failure, but we don't know yet. What happens additionally? The government declared the state of alarm, and only 24 hours afterwards, the state of alarm was actually enacted. What's the problem with this mismatch? That in those 24 hours, a lot of people in Madrid, they went to the coast. They left their residency and they spread the virus.
Oh my, yeah.
So this is part of the, let's say, from the management of the timing of the quarantine, what is most controversial at the moment. Plus, there are additional problems. For example, there have been in the last 10 years at a regional level cuts in the health system, and hospitals have been privatized, and the opposition the opposition that governs in the regional parliament in Madrid, PP, Partido Popular, which is the center-right government, they are the ones managing the crisis in Madrid, and they're accused of not putting in place enough equipment meaning ventilators, tests, masks, hospital beds.
So if I understand it correctly, it's really like a cocktail of very unfortunate situations. It's of course the timing. I mean, in the south of Europe, including Spain and Italy, the virus came first, and meanwhile, Northern European countries had a lot of time to prepare and actually look how things went wrong in Spain and Italy, right? So that's not really something that you can blame on the government. Yeah.
Let's not forget that in Italy, this happened first. It didn't happen simultaneously in Spain and Italy. I can remember very well Renzi speaking in English, surprisingly in English, because he couldn't speak English a few years ago.
Renzi, the former prime minister of Italy.
The former prime minister of Italy, he was saying, I believe a few days before the International Women's Day demonstration, saying, Spain, wake up, prepare. What is happening in Italy is going to happen in Spain. And he was saying this very clearly, and the reaction might have been very slow. But again, we can only judge the whole development when this is over, I believe so.
Yeah, because most of the examples that you give sound to me like decisions that the Netherlands would have easily made as well in their case, because the Netherlands was also fairly relaxed in the beginning and just had the luck that the virus wasn't spreading that quickly yet in the north.
But I find it just surprising, let's say, also seeing the strategy of the Netherlands. Maybe you can go a bit into how it developed in the Netherlands. But also, I mean, they're not comparable, I think, in the UK and the Netherlands. But you see the rules or the restriction of mobility is less severe. Spain is the second most affected country in the world.
Yeah. After Italy, right? More infections than China right now.
Well, now the US, but obviously, yeah.
I would like to give a few notes to your comparison between Spain and the Netherlands. Maybe it would be first useful to defend the Dutch situation and then also put some critical notes to the Dutch situation. First of all, there is a bit of a wrong image created of the Netherlands in European media, describing the Netherlands as if people are living life like before the pandemic. And I can witness with my own eyes that this is not the case. I am myself right now, to earn some extra money, delivering food in my home city, Maastricht, where Martín also lived actually. Yesterday evening, for instance, biking through an inner city that is normally crowded with tourists. I haven't seen a single person on the street for 25 minutes in a row. And I think that is very much comparable to the views you have of cities in Southern Europe where there's a lockdown and where the only people who can go on the street are those who need to do groceries, etc. So that is my first comment, that actually there is no official lockdown, but most people are behaving as if there is a lockdown. In my view, surprisingly, the Dutch are very obedient to the advice of the Dutch government, also because the Dutch government is threatening that if people do not follow the advice, they are forced to actually implement this lockdown.
That's a very interesting point you're highlighting, because actually in Spain, when it was recommended to stay at home, but it was not compulsory, or the state had not taken full power, the emergency state powers, let's say, people were not staying at home. And this is what led to the very rapid escalation of measures. This goes right into the political culture of both countries, where in Netherlands you can have a more liberal approach, and people will comply with the idea that they have to behave responsibly. This goes. You can take it further to the European dimension with the economic discussion, right?
How so?
In the sense that Netherlands might argue that the way Spain behaves, or the Spaniards behave, in their response to the corona crisis,
is economically irresponsible.
It's economically irresponsible. More than that, it shows that Spain does not take this individual responsibility seriously, which Netherlands supposedly does.
Supposedly, yeah, because I definitely wanted to first start with a bit of a positive note and attempt to defend the governmental decision to not go for a full lockdown. But at the same time, I also have to add that the Netherlands has been, at least last week, one of the countries in the world with the most death cases per 1 million inhabitants. We are, and this is a bit of a confusing image, because the Netherlands likes to show right now that they have the capacity to handle the virus, unlike Spain and Italy. But at the same time, the data doesn't lie. So that is my other side of the story, and in that sense, I also do have sympathy with the Belgians who have completely locked down the Dutch-Belgian borders right now, which is, as you can imagine, it's particularly problematic for the city that I'm living in Maastricht, which is completely surrounded by Belgian border. Now they're actually using concrete blocks and material that really reminds you of some kind of Checkpoint Charlie in the Cold War Berlin.
Yeah, no, interesting. And how about the Netherlands has closed borders with Germany as well, or I guess so, right?
You can. It's easier to cross the German border, and that's because Germany and the Netherlands have fairly similar policies. Germany likes to say that their policies are much stricter than the Netherlands, but I think there are a lot of similarities, and they're definitely not going as far as Southern Europe.
I think that is worth mentioning, that applies equally to Germany and Spain, is the tension between the national governance level and the regional governance level, in the sense that you're trying to have a common containment strategy, also regarding sharing equipment and sharing beds, and this in Spain is proving to be a challenge, because although some hospitals from other regions, let's say I'm talking from a Madrid perspective, from Castilla-La Mancha have given equipment to Madrid, they have a lot of spare capacity to take in patients from Madrid. So this would be a possibility, right? And this is at the core of the Spanish. I don't know if to call it containment strategy, or basically it's at the core of the communication problem that there is between the national and the regional level.
Yeah, you're saying that the regions in Spain are not cooperating properly, not even now in the coronavirus crisis.
Exactly. I think also in Germany, as it's a federal country, you have also different responses in each of the regions. So in Bavaria there is a full lockdown, whereas in Berlin there isn't. But I don't know to what extent this is being a management problem for the German state. It would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I think that at least there's a lot of solidarity between the German regions. And even as you said, there is a lot of solidarity between Germany and the other European countries. Germany is helping out actually a lot of other European member states. Let's go a bit further into the more dull part, but actually the most important part of the episode. You having an economic background, I hope you could give us some more clarity about the current economic tensions within the European Union, particularly between Spain and Southern Europe on the one hand, and the Netherlands and Northern Europe on the other hand, and how this is related to the coronavirus.
That's a good question, not easy to answer, but I will try my best. Well, basically, I think the core of the issue is whether this is a crisis that affects each of the countries in the same way, or it doesn't. What economists call, is it a symmetric or asymmetric crisis? And the view of the Southern European countries is that this is a symmetric crisis. So as it affects all of the countries in the same way, the response should be a collective response. Obviously, this is a self-interested argument, because when you have to raise money, or you have to issue debt, and this debt, if you're a South European country, will cost you more to borrow. So if Spain wants to finance its response to the crisis alone, it will face higher costs. So what does Spain say? Spain says we have to have a collective European response by issuing common debt in order to avoid facing the high costs that we would face if we would respond on our own. And on the other hand, the Northern European countries say, hey, this is a systemic crisis, to a symmetric crisis to some extent, but you have not created the conditions to transmit sufficient trust to investors to finance your debt. So this is your structural problem.
So to put it in fairly simple words, Southern Europe says that we have a common crisis, and for that we need, as a solution to the common economic crisis as a result of the coronavirus, we need corona bonds. Can you explain for a second what these corona bonds are?
Well, corona bonds are, as they are, I mean, they can take many forms, but from what I understand, they are a common debt issuance to finance common expenditures. So instead of Spain issuing debt, it would be the European Union issuing debt, and this debt falls equally on all European taxpayers. So it would be financed most likely with a European solidarity tax, which every country pays equally, and this fund would help to finance the expenditures related to the crisis.
So from the Northern European point of view, and particularly the skeptical Northern European point of view, the South is proposing basically a plan in which the Northern European countries are going to pay for policies in Southern Europe. That is actually what it boils down to in the daily life of a Northern European taxpayer.
It will be paid by all European taxpayers.
Yeah. And what was the proposal from the Netherlands and the other Northern European countries?
Well, the latest proposal from the Netherlands, from what I read yesterday on the news, is basically giving money to Spain as a donation, which would amount to 20 billion euros. Maybe you should fact check that afterwards, but it doesn't go to the magnitude of the problem. It's a bit, from my point of view, a charity-like policy proposal, in the sense we don't want to have common debt with Spain. We prefer you to give you the money and you do whatever you want with it. instead of having an actual investment plan with a long-term strategy, which and with obviously a higher amount of money, more expensive, Netherlands is rather opting for, we give you some money and you do whatever you want with it.
Now I also start to understand the difference between those two proposals, because the southern proposal, the proposal of creating corona bonds, is a proposal that doesn't only serve a solution for the corona crisis, but really is a fundamental change in how the European Union works for the longer term too. Whereas the Northern Europeans or the Northern European governments are saying, no, we just need to create a little pot with charity money for this crisis, and afterwards everything goes back to normal, because we don't want to start to pay even more, so to say, to the south.
Exactly, that's a very nice way to put it, because at the end it's about creating or approximating a common fiscal policy, so a coordinated government response, and this would be pooling together different risks that countries face, and this is something that countries which face a very low risk, being it Germany, being it Austria, being it Netherlands, don't want to get involved in, because they would say this would in the long term increase the risk of their own countries, and this goes again to the tension of having a national response or a European response.
Right. This is, in the end, it's again the same old debate that we're always having in the European Union, more or less Europe. Let me put it like this for a second. Let me put it like this. From a point of view of Dutch self-interest, I understand why this is not the most attractive, not the most appealing idea. But if we just take for a second our helicopter and we move from a Dutch level or an Austrian level or a Finnish level, and we move to the European Union level, and we start to think about the future economic stability of the Eurozone, then actually the southern proposal seems to be the most acceptable proposal, right? If we're really looking at the interests of the Eurozone as a whole for the future.
I mean, even like there was a very interesting letter signed by 80 Dutch economists, which was translated to Spanish, and which was basically arguing, like defending a European response out of pure Dutch self-interest, in the sense that if you have a common market, a single market, you have also demand for Dutch products in Spain. So you rather have a partner, an economic partner that has some financial viability in the long term. So even from a narrow economic self-interest for Netherlands in the long term, it makes sense to have economically strong South European partners. I can understand the Dutch position of saying, hey, we had 10 years since the financial crisis, and Spain was obliged to lower their fiscal deficit to a certain percentage point, which they haven't done. And now, when you're in crisis, you should have lowered this fiscal deficit to be able to respond to this crisis. So you're not doing your domestic homework, you haven't done the structural reforms. Why should I now go into the same boat as you from an economic point of view when you are not doing domestically what we have done? So that's the argument of Rutte, right? He says, we have been doing spending cuts and we have suffered for now being able to respond to the crisis.
Yeah. And I mean, we don't have to stick only in the Dutch case, I think. This is a stance shared by most Northern European countries. Only the Dutch are the loudest about it, I think, in the media and in diplomacy. But the Germans agree with it, the Austrians to some extent, and the Finns also very much agree with it.
Well, I would like to add that the same tension that Spain faces with the regions, or it's analogous to the tension that Spain faces with Europe, in the sense that we see the relevance of nation states and the necessity of the European Union, or in the case of Spain, the relevance of regions and the necessity of a national coordinated response. And this will be, let's say, as an outlook question, this will be crucial, this tension between let's say the executive power of nation states in tension with the necessity of having a coordinated European response, also in terms of, for example, a very banal thing, but of buying equipment, right? Of being a common, Europe as one is the one buying masks, buying ventilators. The market is extremely competitive. Spain has received some tests that are fake from China, and all other European countries have also bought fake tests. So we need kind of a coordinated European response also for buying the products that we will need during this crisis.
Martin, before I thank you to be on this podcast, I would like to ask you a question. I assume in quarantine you're also having a lot of hobbies that you would never fulfill normally, including reading. And I thought maybe you can recommend any book to our readers or listeners, I mean, in these times of quarantine.
Well, yes, I think I'm currently reading, it's a classic in political science, but nonetheless, I think it's very interesting, which is The Origins of Political Order by Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama, the very much hated political scientist because of his end of history argument. Yes, no, and basically in this book, he asks himself, where does actual political legitimacy and sovereignty come from? And he goes back to Mesopotamian societies, from the Mesopotamian societies to the Indian caste system, to the European feudal system. And it's very interesting to see how this entire, let's say, loyalty relationship towards a lead between the leader and the people works, and how the narrative has been evolving from, let's say, kinship ties, so blood relations, to a more impersonal way of having legitimacy.
I think it's also a book that you could recommend to your Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, because he seems to be in a bit of a legitimacy crisis right now. Okay, Martin, thank you so much.
I would recommend Pedro Sánchez to take some sleep.
He's looking tired these days, I can completely imagine, yeah. I wouldn't like to be a politician right now. I think we're very privileged just making podcasts and the like.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Jules, for having me. And
thank you, Martin.
We keep in touch.
Yes. Definitely.